Start with session 3 now, which will explore how modeling can inform Canada's transformational project in electricity and industry. So this session brings together a range of perspectives. We have a very diversified panel on the system skills change now underway. It's also an opportunity to share some of the results of yesterday's workshop. We held our second edition of the Multimodal Comparison Forum in that room as well. So 25 modeling teams meet together to discuss P&I and some other interesting projects. So you'll be hearing about this today. So this session will be a little bit longer. Then we'll have another break, and then we'll finish with the lightning round session at the end of the day. So at this stage, I would like to invite the 4 panelists that are already on stage and our moderator, Mo Kabara, which is president of the Transition Accelerator. So Mo is a seasoned energy and industrial policy expert with close to 15 years of experience at the intersection of technology, market, supply chains, and public policy. At the Transition Accelerator, he leads national and regional efforts to support the transformation of Canada's energy and industrial system, low-carbon fuels, and the future of economy. So please join me in welcoming Mo in today's panel to the stage.
All right. So a few years ago, they asked me to do this as well, where we had 6 panelists and 2.5 hours. So this is a bit shorter, but it's going to be buckle up, 2 hours ahead of us. I think the bell was great. Maybe we can have a Santa bell. Might be more. Yeah, get people to come in. I wanted just to kind of start by talking about why I think this session and what we're about to kind of cover today is extremely important to the moment. We've been really talking about the moment that we're in. It's a moment of building things, right? Like building big things, the major projects, projects of national interest. You can kind of pick your synonym that you want to attribute to what the government's been talking about and what we've been really, leaning into. But ultimately, if you think about it, right, the energy transition and the need for building big things and building fast didn't just materialize, in the last few months. It's been with us really for, I would argue, for at least a decade. But I think the language we're using and the sense of urgency that we're having right now seems to be really intersecting with our need to develop our economy and diversify away our trade from the U.S. Like, this is why we have this pressure. We're kind of staring down at a lot of economic, potentially issues related to GDP, jobs, and the question is, how do we catalyze the economy very quickly? And the idea of these major projects is something that I think is certainly worth looking into and exploring and supporting if they can actually deliver on the promise of economic development, trade diversification, and climate action is the third thing. So a lot of people put, including myself, so I'm guilty of that, Venn diagram showing those 3 things and say, we got to do the thing that's in the middle. And I think that's notionally true. That's what we should do. The hard part is actually figuring out what truly is at the center, what is the intersection, which is why I think it's super important to have modeling, analysis that's transparent frameworks, and why I'm really excited about this panel today, because we're going to hear from a lot of different perspectives in terms of, comparing different models from Aaron and Maddie. Tyler's going to talk to us about the federal government's approach in terms of trying to figure out how to model some of the impacts of these major projects. Louise is going to talk to us about how do we get these major projects done, the social acceptance piece, and also Pierre-Marie is going to speak to us about the European model and some of the frameworks that they've used there, and whether there are any lessons learned from that, from those jurisdictions. So I think I'm really excited about this session because I think it helps us translate the current political moment into, what we're here to talk about is like, how do we add analytical rigor to our decision making, right? Like we heard Drew talk earlier about evidence-based policy. I think that everybody really wants that, but it's I would say it's very difficult to achieve when you don't have transparent information. Expertise is increasingly becoming less of a a thing, with the person we have in the White House. So Tylenol killing people. So I think we have to really lean into this moment of honoring and elevating the type of role that EMH has played in terms of making sure there's transparent and rigorous information available for us, especially as we're making these decisions, not only to fast track things, but also to invest a lot of our public money into as well. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing our first two speakers we're going to join together. So first we have Aaron. I'm just looking at Aaron's bio here. So excuse me. He did say that
He's a nice guy.
He's a nice guy.
That's all I need.
He said, don't read the whole thing. There's stuff about sports, hobbies, all of that. We're going to skip. But Aaron is a director of research and modeling at the Energy Modeling Hub, and is also a doctoral researcher at the University of Victoria. And really, his work is focused on connecting the modeling to policy needs across Canada. And also going to be joined by Madeline Seattle, who's the energy system modeler and working on the Open Insights project. And has a background from McMaster and a PhD from University of Victoria. And I'm really excited to kind of hear the work that they've done in terms of the working groups and the modeling comparisons. So with that, I'll kind of hand it over to both of them. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mo. Happy to talk about my hobbies at the reception later. So we're going to be speaking to you today about a exercise we ran yesterday called the Multi-Model Comparison Forum. It was in this room, and so déjà vu, and this is what we'll be running through. So a quick overview on the process, and then we had two of what we call working groups. One is focused on electricity system modeling, and the other on kind of whole energy economy modeling. And so we'll recap some of the results and some preliminary trends that we're seeing there. And then we also did a comparison exercise that tried to look at the power sector and how these two different types of approaching modeling the power sector compare to each other. So I hope I got all the logos right. There were a bunch of teams that took part here, and so a big thank you, most of all, to all of those teams. Representation from the federal government at NRCan and ECCC, a number of consultants, and then also some academic research groups. So for both working groups, the objectives were similar, mostly to understand strengths and weaknesses of our methods with respect to this year representing projects of national interest, and specifically, and then also industrial decarbonization generally. We wanted to zoom in a little bit on how PNIs might influence Canada's energy transition, and of course capacity building. So we wanted the two working groups to talk together and be better at modeling. For the study design, two working groups used a shared scenario, and then we kind of adapted our method, the scenarios to our methods. And we had two main central scenarios for comparison across all teams, and we'll mostly focus on those today. The big challenge for us in designing this is scenario alignment across a bunch of different modeling methods. So everyone views systems differently and translate those into math differently, and so to compare them sometimes takes a little bit of creativity. Perfect.
This is like the start of the fight.
Yeah. I told Edward we wouldn't present unless he did that, so it's on me. So just a quick overview of the two working groups. First, the focus of the electricity system is on mostly capacity expansion and also operation of the power sector. And then for the energy economy working group, it's on economy-wide energy transitions, so representation of far more sectors. The strength of the first working group is really on VRE integration in comparison to the second working group, on representing transmission and on realism, so trying to represent kind of the physics and the engineering of the power sector. Excuse me. Working group 2 focuses on all sectors, and so you can look at how movement in different sectors kind of affect each other, and so one of those dynamics being price responsiveness, and demand response. For the models, the working group 1 models, which Maddie will speak about, those are pretty tightly focused, and that we call them all capacity expansion models. And then for working group 2, there's a bunch of, there's much more diversity, and so there are kind of 3 of each type of these 4 models I have on the slide. For the PNIs, Electricity System Working Group looked at Gull Island, Wind West, and the Darlington SMRs. And then we did the same for working group 2, but also added to those the Pathways CCS project. What we called West Coast LNG, but it's kind of the major LNG export projects in BC and associated gas production. And then we also looked at what we were referring to as Northern Gateway, but that kind of project. Over to you.
Great. Yeah, so I'm going to be going over the Electricity Systems Group, or Working Group 1, what we discussed yesterday and what we've been working on over the past few months. So Aaron briefly introduced it already, but we ran 5 scenarios across the groups. We ran a reference scenario, which was the implemented policy mix specific to the electricity sector. We did industrial carbon pricing. This was at the federal level and also at provincial levels. And then the clean electricity regulations were in there, as well as 2030 coal phase out. The Atlantic Renewables scenario, we were calling it, has the same policies as the reference scenario, as well as the Wind West project, which we specified as being 5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity in Nova Scotia by 2035, and then 40 gigawatts by 2050. This also included some expanded Atlantic transmission capacity, but that also wasn't constrained. That could have expanded past that. The Gull Island project, same sort of thing, same policies as the reference scenario, and then the Gull Island hydro dam and Churchill Falls expansion and upgrade was also in there. Nuclear expansion scenario was reference scenario, of course, and the Darlington SMRs. And then we also, just for a comparison, did a nuclear phase out, which isn't a specific PNI, but we thought might be relevant, which included nuclear retirement at existing end of life, as well as a complete phase out by 2050. So things that I want to note right off the bat for the electricity system models is that demand is exogenous, which means that our electricity demand was an input into the models. So it did not change based on the scenarios we were running and based on the PNIs being built out. Demand growth was also set based on projections, as well, like existing projections that weren't necessarily considering the PNI build out. We'll talk more about this later in the comparison, but something to note looking at these results. As well, technology capital costs are based on, that's a typo, set based on projections and are independent from adoption rate. So, a lot of little call outs on this slide, but as we can see here, these were our results from 2025 to 2050 for the 7 models in Working Group 1 for the national capacity of electricity. First thing I want to point out here is by 2050, our models do not converge, really. There's a lot of different pathways that different models are finding for how to get to the 2050 existing grid in a reference scenario with the existing policies in place. I did want to highlight, the models are anonymized, but I did want to highlight some key points and key strengths of the different models. So we can see that the first model, Model 13, has higher spatial demand and higher temporal resolution. Model 14 has really high policy resolution at the provincial level. Model 15 has some interactions between the supply and demand sector. Model 16 has high spatial resolution for VREs. Model 17 has high spatial resolution for transmission. And then both models 18 and 19 have high temporal resolution. So just some structural things to consider between these models. Though there was an effort made to align on input data, these structural differences likely are contributing to the difference in the outcomes that we're seeing here. And I think good to keep in mind looking at trends going forward. Now, if we look at the national supply, it's been normalized to just look at a proportion of what national supply was being provided by each type of generation. So if we look from 2025 towards 2050, we can see across all models that there's an increase in wind and solar utilization. This was seen no matter the model and no matter the specifics of how that happened. And then there was also a decreased natural gas utilization. So something to note here is by 2050, the clean electricity regulations specify that net carbon emissions need to be zero. There are a certain amount of offsets allowed, but they are priced at a higher, they're priced at like the federal carbon price. So it is much more expensive, and there is still a cap on those. So because of that, we are seeing a decreased natural gas utilization across all the models. But the pathways of how these models are diverting this natural gas is different. And there were kind of two main trends. So we can see that there are three models 15, 16, and 18, that tended to really increase nuclear to displace this natural gas. And the other models tended to just increase it mainly through VREs. So whether this was mostly wind, mostly solar, or a combination thereof, there was obviously slightly different proportions, but those were the major trends we were seeing. So two kind of major pathways despite the difference in actual numbers. So if we look then at the impact of the PNIs, so focusing in first on the Atlantic renewables scenario, this graph might be hard to understand at first. So this is a change from the reference scenario of capacity being built out. So anything above the x-axis will be increased capacity, and below will be a decreased capacity from the reference. So we can see that forcing Wind West to be built, if we look from 2040 onwards, where we're seeing major changes, we can see by 2050 that there was obviously a ton of wind added. We did force the models to build 40 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, so they did do it. But we can also see that there were two models that did actually displace some solar, some nuclear, and some natural gas when this was built. But lots of the models also built these Atlantic renewables, built the Wind West project without actually displacing much generation, meaning that the Wind West project was largely underutilized by the Working Group 1 or the electricity system models. In comparison, if we look at the Gull Island PNI, and if we look at the expansion here, we can see that the hydro capacity that was being built and that increased from the reference scenario was actually displacing some generation. Capacity, we can see lots of times it was displacing natural gas. It was also displacing some wind and solar, but there was some emitting generation being displaced with this PNI. The nuclear expansion scenario with the Darlington SMRs, again, we can actually see a really interesting relation between firm capacity versus variable uncontrollable capacity of wind and solar. So we can see that a small amount of nuclear being built out in all these scenarios was actually able to displace a much greater amount of wind and solar and natural gas capacity because of the firmness and reliability of the nuclear generation as opposed to variable renewables. We can see, especially in Model 17, there was a huge displacement of solar. And then kind of on the other foot, we can see that when nuclear was phased out by 2045 and 2050, we can see that there had to be a large amount of wind and solar added on to meet the same capacity that the nuclear was, or the same firm capacity that nuclear was providing. I mean, especially in Model 16, which was a very nuclear-heavy model result anyway, but also across all the models. There was a larger amount of wind and solar that had to be built compared to the nuclear that was displaced. And then finally, just a bit of an average across all the models. Looking at carbon abatement costs, we can see that the most expensive way from the perspective of just the electricity system models to abate carbon was the Wind West and Atlantic renewables scenario. Nuclear, Gull Island still had a high cost. The cheapest was nuclear expansion. And then nuclear phase out actually showed an increase in total emissions, so was not effective at abating carbon. And I will talk a bit more about these results in relation to Working Group 2 models in a little bit, but I'm now going to hand it to Aaron for a Working Group 2 recap.
So similarly, we had some core scenarios. So we had a reference scenario, which is kind of similar to all the BAU scenarios you see in these types of studies. So a continuation of current energy and economic trends. And then the teams kind of implemented policies as they saw fit in their own models. to reflect kind of what's legislated now. In addition to that, we ran a net zero scenario, and that was kind of policy agnostic in that we just ran emissions constraints or carbon pricing. And so what that means is you kind of let the model choose how best to get to net zero based on how it represents the economy. And then in addition to those, for each P&I, we did a reference scenario and a net zero scenario. So for example, for the CCS project, we had a scenario called reference CCS, and we also had a scenario called net zero CCS. And we did that to try to evaluate the effect of the additional effect, if any, of P&Is. So we actually saw some decent convergence across several metrics. So the first being energy demand. We saw similar trends to 2050 for REF. That may not seem surprising, but given the diversity of methods, it's actually quite a significant finding. We also found about a 30% reduction by 2030 in energy demand in the net zero scenario. And so that was achieved in different models and by different ways, but mostly efficiency and electrification doing the heavy lifting. We also saw in the power sector, in the working group 2 models, substantial additions across nearly all models for onshore wind. For the carbon sequestration results in the reference scenario, there was surprising convergence, I think, at about 15 to 20 megatons CO2 per year by 2050 at the national level. And then for the electricity P&Is, so those were the ones Maddie was just speaking about for working group 1, we did see modest emissions reductions, kind of in line with working group 1's in the reference scenario. But we also saw kind of minimal additional impact under net zero scenarios. And so one way of interpreting that, and we have to look at it more, is that the electricity P&Is mostly, you could call them optimal or as part of an optimal set in the pathways to 2050. This is one example. This may not look like convergence, but it is. This shows the spread across all of our different scenarios and all of our different models. And this is GHGs from 2015, indexed to 2015 by 2050. So this gives you kind of a sense of what this exercise can lead to. It's often the case that modeling teams will do this type of exercise with one model, so their own model, but it's rare that you have access to compare against a bunch of other models. And so this kind of analysis, even though it's very top level, can start to give us insights about our methods and hopefully allow us to make better modeling decisions. We did have, as you expect, significant divergence. One thing I wanted to highlight especially is hydrogen uptake. It was the largest source of divergence, so this would be in end-use energy demand. Some models saw like quite a major end-use role in a net zero future, while others did not. The second point there is the electricity system size. So there was quite a variance between the minimum and the maximum installed capacity by 2050, even in the reference, so about 1.5 to 2 times difference. Which, when you consider the size of the electricity system, is quite a lot. Generation mix, there was a key split on unabated gas versus battery storage in net zero pathways, and that mostly has to do with how different models represent the electricity sector. And then on the Pathways CCS project, this was interesting. Emissions reductions ranged from 3 megatons to over 25 megatons by the model. Again, that's explained by differences in model structure. And again, the fossil fuel projects in general were showing the widest divergence. This is just a graph of end-use demand by energy carrier or by fuel in 2050 in the net zero runs, just to give you a picture of what I'm talking about. And this would be relative makeup. So the main thing here to see, I think, is that we see electricity uptake quite consistently across these models, but then kind of the rest of end-use demand is split a lot among different fuels. So while we think electrification, well, we know electrification obviously is so important, the rest of the energy system is kind of settling out in the runs.
So getting a little bit into the, back to the title fight, you could say, between the Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 comparison, what we want to highlight here is the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different models that Aaron pointed out before. The big thing that I think will be relevant to this discussion or this explanation going forward is the difference between, or the supply and demand interactions that can happen in energy economy models that the electricity system models were not able to see and be aware of. So if we look at just the average electricity system capacity in both teams or both groups' references scenarios, we can see that starting off in 2050, the energy economy models see higher electrification than the electricity system models were assuming. But by 2050, in the reference scenario, they end up at around the same level. So keeping that in mind for further comparison going forward is interesting that the 2050 reference runs end up at a similar spot in terms of total capacity, even though the makeup's slightly different. So we can see here that energy economy models overestimate the hydro capacity and tend to, sorry, I'm speaking as the electricity system model lead and using the electricity system models as a source of truth, but have a higher makeup of hydro capacity than the electricity system models. Similarly show more natural gas capacity and less solar capacity, but very similar amounts of wind. But when we look at the supply, lots of times sorry, to give a bit more background, to step back for a second, to put the cart before the horse, but the wind usage in the electricity sector, or the electricity system models, was a lot higher. We believe this is due to the temporal resolution of the models. Electricity system models tended to operate at hourly time steps for dispatch of VREs, versus not all the energy economy models did. So they tended to potentially, if we're using the electricity system models as a source of truth, underestimate the utilization of wind capacity. Similarly, the electricity system models saw further supply from storage, which also could contribute to the increased wind usage. But what was interesting is that both models showed a somewhat similar decrease in natural gas utilization. When we did a quick comparison about the utilization ratio of wind and solar between the different models, we can see that the electricity system models and the energy economy models had similar utilization of solar despite the differences in time steps for operational dispatch. But as mentioned before, the electricity system models tended to utilize wind more or potentially better, depending on your perspective. I see that we're running a bit low on time, so I will keep it brief, but if we look then at a comparison in a PNI scenario, so this is for the wind-west comparison, we can actually see that interaction in energy economy models between the supply and demand sector, when you're forcing a model to build 40 gigawatts of wind, does change. So we can actually see that the supply in the energy economy models is significantly higher in these scenarios compared to the electricity system models. Because of that, when the energy economy models can see that there's this capacity there, they're better able to utilize it and increase electrification accordingly. What's interesting, though, is because there was still a low utilization of storage, we can actually see that the wind usage between the two models was at a similar rate, even though there was still a lot of electrification in the energy economy models, maybe showing that increased temporal resolution for that dispatch and for storage in particular may better represent how real-world electricity system dynamics in energy economy models. And then just to prove my point, if we look at this Gull Island scenario, we can actually see the opposite impact. So forcing the Gull Island project to go ahead, as well as Churchill Falls expansion, actually showed that there was a decrease in electrification in the energy economy models, potentially due to an increase in electricity price due to this PNI being built. So we can see the supply-demand interaction having a significant impact in the electrification and in then the resulting effectiveness of these PNIs that potentially the electricity system models aren't able to capture. And then I believe, hand it back to Aaron for a wrap-up.
Thank you. So just two main takeaways, I think, at a high level. After we made this, we were thinking about how does this kind of generalize into policy implications and what do we mostly want to communicate? And I think first it's that model diversity is a feature, so it can be easy to look at these results and say, like, nobody knows what they're doing. The spread across models actually helps us better understand uncertainty. It's really valuable for decision making. For the electricity system models, mostly here discussion revolved around sensitivities of models to structural differences. Whereas for the energy economy models, the discussion surfaced key uncertainties and assumptions, and so some of those were kind of like the modeler's philosophy, around techno-optimism versus pessimism, and then also our carbon removal assumptions, so DAC and CCS specifically, those varied a lot. Biomass potential, so are we representing, for example, constraints on supply for biomass, and then oil and gas trajectories. For policy implications, I think it's mostly at a high level around kind of like technology agnostic policy design versus picking winners, and kind of at a temporal level. So what I mean is later in the models, because the outcomes are so wide-ranging with respect to uptake of alternative technologies and paths to net zero, it's quite costly for there to be investment in technologies that don't actually win out over others. And so maybe when you can see 2 or 3 years in front of you, you can identify winners, and so maybe then targeted investment programs are quite intelligent. We're projecting, 3 decades into the future, and we're mostly modeling under carbon pricing, which is kind of cost minimizing. And so because of that uncertainty, it's certainly less useful to pick winners out to 2050. And that's it for us. Special thanks to all these folks on the screen.
I also want to say that all the Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 results are available for anyone to look at this link below. And ideally, these slides will be shared, so you can just click through and see them. But all the plots and data will be there if you want to explore them further. So thank you.
All right, this was great. We're going to do questions. So the way that, just to kind of keep everybody engaged, feel free to submit your questions on Slido, and then I'll weave them into the conversation here in the discussion with Aaron and Maddie. I mean, be remiss if I don't say this at an Energy Modeling Hub gathering, is that all models are wrong. Some are useful, is exactly the verbiage that I've used, and I think we kind of understand that. Yeah, we can see this huge range, but there's a lot of utility from, as Aaron was saying, from doing this analysis. So I'm just gonna ask a couple of questions here to start with. Given that one of the questions that we got really, it's that, like, what is the ideal combination of using these different types of model, electricity, I think in this case, energy economy models, but also potentially even further than just looking at those, like, for example, macroeconomic modeling or looking at project-specific modeling to really understand, assess the impacts of these types of projects in the future. Like, I know this is a great starting point, but what do you think we need more in terms of that model comparison?
I'll start us off. I think depending on the question you're asking and the relevant sectors and impacts, potential impacts of that, will determine what the ideal models to use are. I also think there's huge benefit to linking models and using some of these models together to capture these feedbacks between different sectors without having to build one huge super model that will only run at a second per second and then just be real life. So I think it depends on the specifics of the question, but yeah.
And yeah, maybe to add, the way that these models tend to work is that they generalize maybe across provinces or maybe like a half of a province. And so if you're evaluating industrial projects specifically, and you're able to characterize that kind of in the present day, even on a spreadsheet, it's helpful to compare that to the generalized model and try to kind of approximate the project in those higher level results. And so that's hard to do. The data is usually proprietary, or you have to make pretty broad assumptions like we did in this exercise. But you can kind of ground truth the models, so to speak, if you can characterize the project. And that doesn't have to be anything fancy.
Yeah. One question from me. I'm curious about to understand the parameters there. So was the idea that all of, for example, Wind West will be exported to meet electricity demand for the rest of Canada? Was that like no exports outside of Canada? So you're just building 40 gigawatts, and that's why we're seeing displacement of solar, because that means solar is not being built in Saskatchewan, for example, Alberta, because we're assuming a whole connected grid.
Yeah, so the electricity system models all had interprovincial transmission. Within the province, there was some discrepancy in the structural makeup of the models. Some models did actually represent international trade, like endogenously within their model, but most used a fixed time series. So that Wind West project wasn't capturing maybe potential export markets to the US or to other countries. The expectation that we had was that there would be a ton of transmission built out, and this project would then power other provinces like pretty significantly. But what we at least saw within the electricity system models from the way we parameterized these scenarios was that it was cheaper for provinces to build power locally instead of investing in transmission lines. And this is obviously dependent on the techno-economic assumptions we made about transmission costs. But and again, we weren't seeing that supply-demand feedback of forcing our models to build this project and then the potential benefit they had going forward. So, or that project had once it was built going forward. But that's speaking from the electricity system.
And that's why you saw that huge carbon abatement cost
Exactly.
in like thousands of dollars.
Exactly.
Okay.
I can add there too. So we modeled the same thing and did have some of those sectoral connections. And so I think if I'm remembering correctly, we saw one model basically building a bunch of ammonia plants for export. And so in the model, basically it like created a sector from that value where maybe we wouldn't have imagined that before.
Yeah, and I guess on that, we saw that huge delta on hydrogen end use demand. I think you mentioned it, Aaron. What does that mean? Like, are we talking about it? Because I feel like a difference between 3% hydrogen in the end use and 6% is a difference of having all of Quebec's electricity system incrementally needed to produce that as green hydrogen. So I think what's the difference when you say there was a huge kind of spread
percentage
terms?
or
roughly like in terms of the role that hydrogen is playing in terms of end use.
Maybe roughly like on the low end, 1% of end use demand, on the high end, 20%. So
okay,
like an enormous,
that's a huge.
Yeah. And I think mostly it was happening in industrial heat instead of fuel switching to electricity.
Okay, and was that being produced from electrolysis or also blue hydrogen from natural gas? Or
likely both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a question here. One of the questions is, did any of the models generate equity/distribution results? It would be interesting to see if these differed between models that agreed at a top level.
No, unless Working Group 1 did?
There was one group that did a preliminary analysis, but nothing formal.
So one
Nothing
group
formal.
did a preliminary analysis, but nothing formal for Working Group 1, and Working Group 2 did not. To my knowledge, and I'd say maybe to add to that, like the kind of outputs of these models, while useful, are pretty tight in scope if you consider what you would want to be like analyzing these projects over in terms of evaluation criteria. So no, we didn't explicitly do that for this.
The one Working Group 1 model, like the electricity system model that did do it, did find that when provinces optimized for like their own benefits as opposed to kind of a single system operator perspective, I believe it was 14% more expensive to run the reference scenario, which shouldn't be surprising.
Okay. Got a few more minutes here. I'm going to keep going through some of these questions. One of the questions was there any data sharing between the teams, or each team kind of made their own assumptions?
For the electricity system model, we did all try, or most teams tried to align to the coders database. It holds quite a lot of electricity system data. I know it's slightly different for Working Group 2, but there was still some alignment. there was also a lot of collaboration, for sure, at least speaking from the electricity system models in terms of helping to parameterize and groups that had more knowledge or a better understanding of specific policies, sharing that knowledge with the other teams and trying to share some high-level data. Some's obviously proprietary, but as best we could, there was a lot of collaboration.
One question for maybe Aaron. It's really about the impact of other countries and what they've done in terms of meeting net zero, spillovers from whether it's on the technology side. I'm assuming, I would assume that you didn't really explicitly model that. I guess link it back to a question I had, which is when you're looking at the Pathways project impact, the big range there in terms of the megatons, I think it was 3 to 25 or something like that, if I remember correctly. Did you model out the actual impact of oil demand as one area in terms of, or did we assume that we're just going to be exporting 4 million barrels a day in 2050?
So some models did look into that and kind of would have a better representation of oil market dynamics.
Yeah.
And that actually explains that big difference.
So that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
If that big difference is because some people were assuming lower.
Totally.
It's not just the actual impact of the carbon capture.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And so, to elaborate, teams that were kind of bottom up would say that project does that much, and that's it for carbon capture. Whereas teams that connected their sectors, you could see kind of unexpected spillover effects.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess one of the other questions here is related to basically those technologies. So many energy economy models build the large amounts of technologies like hydrogen, DAX, BECCS as optimal. I guess they're kind of a magic bullet you can just throw into the model to get to net zero. But they're effectively slack variables to get to system net zero, which is what I just said. So what did Working Group 2 discuss as ways to get more meaningful modeling outputs?
Yeah, we had I think a good discussion on this yesterday, and it was around the assumptions we're making on what we call backstop technologies. Not super catchy, but effectively the assumptions you make around them really dictate what else happens in the model. And we did not really place constraints on them for this round because we wanted to understand kind of at a higher level what reference assumptions different teams make about what's reasonable. And when you start having a discussion about what is reasonable, it's a whole can of worms.
Yeah. Final question. How difficult was it to model these projects of natural interest, given the uncertainty that we have around their size, impacts, costs, all of that?
I mean, I think everyone had to make assumptions. Actually implementing them into the model, I'm sure differed team to team. That wasn't the hard part. It's more so figuring out what is actually trying to be conveyed by these kind of announcements of these PNIs. Like, are these numbers representative or are they real? And what does that entail in terms of knock-on effects of other projects?
Modeling the politics is a fun way to end this conversation. So with that, I really thanks Aaron and Maddie. Let's give it a round of applause. And this is actually a great segue to our next speaker. Next speaker is Tyler Markowski. He's an economist with Natural Resources Canada with 15 years of experience providing high-impact analysis for governments across Canada. And he has developed new methods that have guided decisions by key decision makers from prime ministers, premiers, mayors, and has led teams advising senior officials on trillions in economic activity. So really happy to have Tyler here speak to us about some of the work that Natural Resources is doing as it relates to these major projects. Please help me in welcoming Tyler.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be in a room with so many whose work has shaped how we understand energy systems in this country. My own path has been a bit unconventional. I trained in energy modeling under Professor Václav Smil, and I studied Professor Mark Jacquard quite intensively. But I've also spent a great deal of time living and working on heavy construction sites. I used to run equipment like excavators and a bunch of other equipment as well. And I've seen how some of these projects are built from the ground up. In a sense, that combination, analytical perspective paired with physical, on-the-ground experience, informs the work that my colleagues and I are doing at Natural Resources Canada. Sorry, what do I press to click?
There's a clicker.
Right there. Perfect. Budget 2025 states this plainly. The world is undergoing shifts in speed, scale, and scope not seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The document puts it bluntly. This is not a transition, it is a rupture. The rules-based trading system that supported Canada's prosperity for decades is being reshaped. Industrial policy is returning to the forefront. And Canada must now build an enormous amount of infrastructure, energy, minerals, transmission, trade corridors at speeds and scale we haven't witnessed in generations. The federal government responded by establishing the Major Projects Office and identifying projects of national interest. These projects range from conceptual ideas to shovel-ready builds. This is the context in which our analytical work is taking place. Energy system models and macroeconomic frameworks remain foundational. We do rely heavily on those outputs, and they shape how we understand pathways decades out. But in today's policy environment, there is a challenge of fit. Many of our established models are built to answer questions about outputs, levelized costs of energy, GDP, emissions trajectories, energy prices. These remain essential. But the questions many policymakers now face are increasingly about inputs and constraints, not what will this project produce, but what does it take to build it? Where will the steel come from? Which occupations will be scarce? What supply chain dependencies exist? How long do specific construction phases actually take? What trade relationships are we exposed to? These are questions about physical reality, the material inputs that must be procured, manufactured, transported, and assembled long before a single megawatt is produced. Another complication is the variance in the projects themselves. I imagine the folks who are modeling this could see how much all of those inputs are different. Candidate projects differ widely in their completedness and the quality of their information. Some have detailed Class 5 engineering work, and others have secured capital through Canada Infrastructure Bank and others. Others are very far from that and earlier in concept. So our analytical approaches must be very flexible. Our aspiration is to support a shift from reliance to resilience. But what does resilience actually require? To answer that, we have been developing detailed supply chain models. Anyone who has worked in this space understands the challenges with recursion, tracing inputs through multiple layers, and we continue to deepen these models as time and resources allow. The approach begins with the capital investment estimates for a given project. Here in this case is a transmission example, and then we work backward from capacity targets to physical inputs. How much concrete do we need? How much steel? Which components? In what quantities? And at what point in time? This forms the foundation of our supply chain analysis. Here is another hypothetical example for offshore wind. On the left is some of the output, estimating component demand through 2050. Blades, towers, rotors, direct drive generators, substructures, yaw pitch systems, thousands of units ramping through the 2030s and 2040s. This is not a forecast, this is a translation. We began with capacity targets and asked, What does it take to physically build this? What objects must be manufactured, transported, assembled, and installed? The answer is roughly 10,000 components by 2050. And again, for those who've worked with supply chains, it's a lot more than 10,000 pieces. The scale is a huge procurement challenge. The scale of this is a huge workforce challenge. That is the scale of the supply chain that we must be creating. The next question naturally becomes, where do these inputs come from today? So you can take this information and pair it with harmonized system statistics. And so Finnish turbines, Canada runs, based on a 5-year average, a very significant deficit for turbines. We also have significant deficits in terms of trade for virtually all of the components for some of these systems. Here's a hypothetical transmission project analyzed through another model that we have, a macroeconomic input-output model. We began again with capital cost breakdowns. From here, the model uses heuristics to infer labor requirements by occupation. The chart displays a cumulative labor demand ordered from highest to lowest. I stopped it at 60% because it tails off, goes out to about 500. Importantly, the model can produce a lot more details than this. It can be annualized. You can do phase-specific outputs. It can identify, for example, peak demand for specialized electricians, peak demand for specialized welders, sustained project management requirements. This goes far beyond the number of jobs and identifies which occupations in which years and at what scale. This is the kind of information that informs workforce planning and critically can be validated. Proponents can look at these numbers and say that yes, it aligns with our engineering or not. So we're happy to obviously take more information from projects and refine the models. So what does this type of analysis enable? First, supply chain strategy. If we know we need $376 million in turbine imports and 84% comes from one country, we can identify exposure and plan diversification. Second, workforce planning. If we know when specific occupations peak, we can align training programs, coordinate with provinces, and anticipate inter-project labor competition. Third, we can look at infrastructure linkages. Many projects compete for the same inputs: steel, trades, port capacity. There's also other linkages such as dependency on a road being built or dependency on a transmission line being built or sewer and water communications. Fourth, industrial strategy. Understanding potential demand helps identify opportunities to begin developing Canadian capacity, whether for turbine towers, blade manufacturing, or critical magnet supply chains. But the model doesn't make decisions, it simply makes decisions possible by surfacing the physical realities that policy must contend with. Let me end with a simple point. Canada is entering a period where the country's prosperity depends not just on what we choose to build, but on whether we have the capacity to build it. The analysis I've shown today, supply chains, trade, labor, is about making that capacity visible. It's about identifying constraints early, understanding their sources, and giving policymakers the tools to act with clarity. From reliance to resilience, it's not a slogan, it is a practical, measurable shift. From assuming supply chains will hold to testing them. From assuming labor will materialize to planning for it. From hoping timelines are realistic to grounding them in physical detail. Our goal at NRCan is to support that shift, by translating ambitions into the material and human requirements needed to achieve them. Thank you. Oops. Oh, yeah. Making a big mess here.
Thanks so much, Tyler. This was great. Again, put in some questions. I'll kind of use them to weave into the conversation. Tyler, this is great. Your last comment there on really the role that you're playing to help make sure that we're understanding the. I really like the way that you framed it because I've used similar language in the past. What are the material and conditions and, like you said, human resources required to make these things happen? How would you describe, without discussing any specific projects, but how would you describe how you feel modeling has really helped, or your team has been helping kind of provide that consistent input to support the Major Projects Office?
The crickets is from me. Does this work? Yeah, okay. I'm not going to speak specifically to any of the major projects or the projects that are happening with the Major Projects Office, but, something that I took from Professor Václav Smil and other mentors of mine is what gets measured gets done. If you put a number to things that are fairly abstract, it can really make the decisions easier in a way. It becomes tangible. So a lot of the modeling that we've been doing is trying to take abstract, hydrogen projections, for example. We worked with some stakeholders where they had projections of hydrogen, and what we did is we helped estimate how much that would cost. Basically, what's the capital cost of doing that? And they hadn't done that step, and just by putting a dollar amount to it, it changed their policy basically. So I think that what we're trying to do is put tangible numbers to some of the things that are really complex, really abstract to most of the people outside of this room. The folks in this room understand this stuff, but most others don't understand this stuff.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it doesn't even have to be very complicated, right? It's just like getting into the right ballpark, understanding, is this completely out to lunch, or is it a slam dunk, and you can sort of be somewhere in between. And it's really understanding like some of those general assumptions in terms of grounding it in the reality, right? Like so.
Absolutely, and I would also say that it's a bit of a false precision. I find that because there's so much uncertainty in not only these projects, like the assumptions that are being put into the models. Those fundamental inputs are just so uncertain. And yes, we use methods to identify range and uncertainty and things like that, but it's a bit of a false precision thing, I'd say.
One question from the internet is, what kind of data feeds into your modeling?
So the models themselves are built on pretty commonly used, Statistics Canada information, so supply use tables or harmonized system statistics. So the models themselves are based on pretty standard stuff. In terms of the inputs from particular projects, usually it boils down to capital cost estimates. So as detailed as possible on the CapEx side is usually what we look for.
Is any of the data open source or available, or would your model be made open source at some point? Also, a correct answer for that could be no, but so not to put you under pressure.
Yeah. So the project inputs are not like what we're working with is not open source. Although the truth is, there's a lot of public information on some of these projects. You can just Google it.
Yeah.
In terms of the structure of the models, like I said, a lot of it's built on Stats Canada supply use tables and things like that, and you can just go to the web and download it.
Yeah. I want to bring it back to one of the last points you had, and actually bring it back to Bruno's presentation from this morning about green industrial policy. To what extent have you looked at the linkages between the different supply chains that can basically translate as part of a vision? So if your vision is to develop a battery ecosystem, for example, which was one of the things that we want to do, looking at the critical minerals supply chain, looking at the EV supply chain that would be downstream and upstream from where those things are at. And yeah, like to what extent is it really important to have that anchor from an industrial policy perspective that Bruno was talking about, which is China in 2005 said, we're going to be leaders in solar and batteries, and 20 years later they are. But so any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're working on it. Step one was sort of starting to build out those models and measure them, and then once you can, integrate them, bring them together, it will show the cumulative effects. I think we're going to be working on that for sure. But right now they're independent, and on their own they're used like a diagnostic. I would say it's like, given X, here's what you need. But obviously bringing them together makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. One question really in the weeds on HS codes, NAICS codes, and basically saying that those were not necessarily designed to accommodate clean technology, so grouping them with dirty technologies. Have the data issues been a challenge for you?
Yeah, I mean, we all can attest to challenges with data for sure. HS, it measures trade at the border, and it looks at international trade. In Canada, we've been looking at our own interprovincial trade issues, and so our team was looking at trying to complete the picture between the two, and guess what? Those two data sets are different. So if you want to look outside of Canada, you use X data set, and if you want to look inside of Canada, it's a different data set, and you have to harmonize those together. So data is always a challenge.
Have you looked at the export markets for us? Like, one of the things we're really leaning into as a government and as a country is export diversification. We've recently done analysis on a lot of HS codes and what's growing outside of Canada on those supply chains, and how are we exporting relatively to the US? Have you looked at that as part of your boundary conditions in your models yet, or just looking internally?
So my team is certainly looking at some of that, and colleagues in this room as well are studying that in depth for sure.
Some of these questions are more suitable for Prime Minister Carney, maybe, but so I will not pose them. But any final thoughts? Really appreciate all the work that you're doing to help provide this kind of analytical rigor to some of these exciting projects that are coming up. But any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, I'm just really grateful for all of the work that everyone in this room is doing. Like, we do have a pretty serious challenge ahead of us, and the fact that we're starting to bring all these models together to see the variance and is critical, because no, like you said, no model is perfect, and some are useful, and I think that if we bring them together, it's going to start informing on some of these really complex things we have to contend with.
Thanks. We're going to make T-shirts for next year for them. All right, let's give it up for Tyler for amazing presentation. Okay, so moving on. How's everybody's energy level? We're kind of more than halfway through. We call it a mega panel. I think that's it's a little bit of a Trumpian thing here, but yeah. Yeah, exactly. Nobody's seen as panel as big. Yeah. So next up we have Louise Como, who is a senior advisor at Reclimate, which is Carleton's Center for Climate Change Communications. Over 30 years of experience in climate policy, comms, and advocacy, and she really focuses on the social acceptance piece of climate policies and the energy transition, especially electrification. So we've been talking about what we should be building, the impact of building these things, how we should be building them in terms of the resources, the material conditions, as Tyler mentioned. Louise is going to talk to us about the human component, really about the social support that is required to get these things actually built, especially these big projects that are going to be in people's backyards. So give it up to Louise, who's going to give us a great presentation.
So a couple of things. First of all, thank you to all the people who are online. I know it's a long day when you hang in there. I've done it many, many times. Second of all, how many of you talk to your friends and family about the work you do? How does it go? Is today a sign of what it might be like in terms of this one-way communication? Or do you feel like you're getting through to the folks that know what you do? Do you feel you're getting through? I can tell you, after 30, 35 years, I do have a hard time getting my head around the modeling side of it. I got to tell you, it's a bit opaque. But the reason I do the work that I do, and that I'm going to share with you, is down to a basic stat, that if we think we're going to increase the size of the electricity system 1.5 to 2 times, I think there's a missing component here. And I would say it's highly improbable that that's a lift we're going to be able to do without a lot of human resistance, at least based on the research that I do now. And that's kind of the dynamic at Reclimate. We are a bridge in terms of research to practitioners, to people who are actually working to try to engage the public, consult with the public, engaged in climate change communications, and so on. And it's that practical dynamic that I hope we can bring to the conversation here. Now I'm pushing buttons. What should I do? There we are. Click harder. So I'm truly asking this question. Can you model me this? The story I'm about to tell you, and how I see in the work that I do the pathway to getting to yes on large-scale wind and transmission projects. Now, these are very preliminary results. It's a massive research project. I could spend the whole day talking to you about what we've got, and I'm giving you this much. But there's much more to come, and we have a table outside, and if you want to talk more after, please do. But let me scope out what the scale of this research is. A national survey of Canadians with over 4,230 cases. Focus groups organized by postal codes where people have been exposed to wind and transmission projects either through just hearing about it or because a project is proposed in their communities or something has been built. So we've done 2 focus groups in Nova Scotia, 1 in Ontario, a national survey. We've also done interviews. We've also done a review of social media feeds of groups that have concerns or are opposed to projects, and talk to all sorts of folks, developers, governments, that kind of thing. So we feel we're getting a pretty good sense of where people are at through this listening process. And this is the 3rd time I've engaged in this particular kind of research, looking at questions of social acceptance. So in the background, some good stuff, some good news. We asked people whether or not they felt more pride thinking about Canada becoming a renewable energy superpower over becoming an oil and gas superpower, and then we reversed that. In broad strokes, Canadians are more leaning into becoming a renewable energy superpower. So we have background at a high level of values support. And that is a majority across the country, including in Alberta, but very high in the Atlantic. Very, very high. Nova Scotia, all in. Newfoundland, Labrador, all in. Why am I pressing and not getting what I want? Battery? Oh, I got it. As we often do, we ask at a high level, generally speaking, what kind of energy sources do you prefer? And the ranking, forget the numbers for the moment, the ranking is interesting. Now, I will also say to you, there is a familiarity effect. You will see, for example, in a province like Ontario or New Brunswick that has more nuclear, somewhat higher scores. But this is the general ranking that you see with solar at the top, then hydro, onshore, offshore wind and transmission in the middle, gas, LNG, and nuclear. But if you ask the question in a different way, which is if a large-scale onshore or offshore wind or transmission project is proposed, near to where you live, so now we go from the social level to the more individual or community level, you see quite a significant drop, 12 points on the wind and about 9 points on the transmission. And as a project gets more and more concrete, you end up having more of an attitude development, people's evaluation processes begin, and if you don't engage correctly in the process, you can have significant long-term damage, which we have seen in the research in Ontario. Ontario is a very hard lift. People in our focus groups were still complaining about Dalton McGuinty and the Green Energy Act. Once you've lost trust, it is extremely difficult to get it back. So we asked in the research what factors, what principles were most important to people. And I was quite surprised because the top two are really character-based. People really want, and said so in the focus groups, they want accountability, they want transparency by developers and governments. They want to know, they want that to be open book as much as we can possibly do. Then they're thinking about things like benefits, whether that's to their household, compensation if you're a fisher or you've lost viewscape, and the participatory fairness elements, participation and influence are important, but rank a little bit more at the bottom. And they vary by whether you're a supporter or an opposer. Some want more participation, some want more influence, but accountability and transparency is literally the currency. We also measured trust. All of our supports for action are really through the currency of trust. And trust has different components: competence component, credibility, reliability, integrity, and care. And what we find is that opposers are more likely to believe their province is biased, lacks credibility, too influenced by industry, that kind of thing. And supporters tend to believe that their province is more competent, credible, acts with integrity and care. Now, overall, these numbers still are low. Trust is relatively low, but these dynamics are important. You want to minimize perceptions of bias, maximize perceptions of integrity, care, and so on. We asked a number of questions about what is your concerns in terms of the opposer group. And top of the list of people who oppose these projects are health concerns and killing birds, spoiling natural landscapes, worries about effects on water, worries about lower property values, that the technology doesn't work, causes cancer, or oil spills are at the bottom four. But the list is made up of things we knew to be misinformation. And you can see very high levels, 29% think wind turbines or transmission will cause cancer. And so we do need to offer information. We do need to counter misinformation and disinformation. It is real. It is having an effect. And there are other issues, of course, that have come up in the open-ended comments, including aesthetics. People don't always think a wind turbine is beautiful. Okay. I got it. It's good. I'm going to keep charging along. We also asked people, what kind of community benefits do you want? Now, I was very surprised at these results because, yes, people are concerned about cost of living, but I didn't expect that the number 1 and 2 things that people want, even though environmental and nature protection is part of it, is they want power bill reductions and they want property tax reductions. They want job training. But the things we sell projects on, investments in community infrastructure, land lease payments, social infrastructure, joint ownership, are actually at the bottom of the list. We also asked, whether or not community benefits agreements would increase or decrease your opposition to projects. And fortunately, 43% say they would increase their support for projects. So it's a value, it's something, it's important. And we do find, as I mentioned, differences between opposers and supporters. Supporters believe these projects will have benefits to the environment. That's what they're looking for. In addition, they've got that personal, I'd like some personal benefits, but they want to know the environment's being protected. Whereas opposers are much more concerned about the direct financial benefits and their concerns for themselves. They believe that these projects will make them worse off financially. So let me give you a summary of really, truly, it's so rich, but I'll just give you a little bit, a summary from a human perspective. People are concerned about their cost of living, and they want direct benefits. How are we going to deliver power bill reductions if all of this investment is on the rate base? No. How are we going to deliver lower property taxes? There is potential for that. It was clear in the focus groups. People said, okay, maybe I don't get a reduction, but maybe the future increases are minimized. And we know these projects generate lots of property tax revenue to municipalities potentially. How does that get distributed? People want to know. We need to look at these off-rate base options. We also need to really focus in on the why. We have to democratize this process. People want to know, what does this project do? How does it contribute to the overall story? What's my role in it? What are the system benefits? Is it going to be a more reliable, resilient system that supports electrification? What are the benefits to Canada? The question of this patriotism mood that we're in was shocking in the focus groups. Literally, people do not want any of our electricity to go to the US. It's not practical, I understand. We need to deal with it, it's a real thing. And people want to hear more about actual experience, not arguments, not debate, not negativity. How did it go in your community? Bringing in municipalities, the treasurers so they can talk about what happened and the revenue that they raised. More real experience. We need more independent, fact-based information, and we know that governments are not that trusted. Who's going to provide it? And it has to cover all of these issues. Basics. Why don't the turbines turn all the time? Came up constantly in the focus groups. Want to know the project economics, the life cycle effects, the project reclamation plan. What are the mixed-use opportunities, health and environmental effects, and so on. We need to increase trust. Truly, once lost, it is not recovered. You need to focus on how do we reduce bias? What kind of radical approach can we be taking to transparency and accountability? And we need to be able to grow the perception that the people dealing with these projects are not hype, but they're competent, they're careful, they have integrity. And finally, I want to share that misinformation and disinformation is having a serious effect on support for these projects. We are really looking and seeing in the analysis we're doing of the commentary from groups who I have no worries about legitimate concerns. There's a lot of it. But it unfortunately is also being connected to the conspiracy mindset. So anti-vax, anti-climate, anti-UN, anti-global, is now anti-15-minute city, is all being tied into anti-wind, anti-transmission, anti-energy transition. Just finally to say, I know I've gone a bit over, my apologies, that we tested narratives in this work, and I can tell you positive stories about why we're doing what we're doing. People are down for it. We increase support for wind and transmission by an enormous amount when it comes to social science study. The story matters. Be careful how you're speaking, and net zero isn't it. Let me just close by saying people want accountability and transparency. They want to know the why. They want to be part of this bigger story about where we're going, how the project we are asking them to put up with fits in that broader journey. If you want to know more, come to our webinar in February. Let me know, and I'll make sure you're invited. We have a top-line webinar February 12th, and guidance documents will be presenting at the end of March, early April. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Thank you so much, Louise. Lots to dive into here. In this room, how many people believe wind turbines cause cancer? It's a pretty, 1 in 3 people in the study, which is really surprising. I guess, were there any other, like all the stuff that we saw, were like some of the opposition, were there legitimate or concerns that were brought up, that like, should be taken more seriously?
I would say most of the concerns are legitimate. Remembering that pullout on the, it's 1/3 of people who oppose. It's not 1/3 of the entire sample, so don't panic.
Okay.
But it is a perception of those who oppose, right? If I could leave you with one thing to take home, and I can tell you it is absolutely grounded in strong evidence and social science research over decades, that the social science community has a strong argument against the perception that NIMBYism is behind all of this. What I would say is that we do owe people respect for their legitimate concerns and to engage them in this conversation. We are not getting to where we want to go if we don't. And that respect is not present. It's just not. It's not present in how the developers are engaging communities. It's not present in how things are being regulated. We don't engage people early, often, and with care. And so to me, what's surprising is not so much what I learned in the sample. I'm surprised about us. Not hearing, not accepting, not believing, not trusting, that's what I'm surprised by. And then finally, I'm really surprised that people wanted accountability and transparency over money.
And you mentioned vision as one of the key things. It's people being able to see themselves as part of this.
It was really special. I listened to a lot of people in focus groups. I got to tell you, if there's a place in the country where trust is the highest, support for renewables is high, it's Nova Scotia. Really, all we can do right now is mess it up. And people in Cape Breton were like, I want to know that these projects, like, tell me how they're going to make things more resilient, more reliable, that I get to make a contribution to it. And we don't tell that story. And again, I'll repeat it, net zero isn't it.
And I think this is really, I mean, I don't know where Daniel is, but one of the key things on transition theory is like, basically selling the vision, and I would say like the Wind West stuff, you can criticize the 60 gigawatts as unrealistic, but like it's not really about the 60 gigawatt or the 40 gigawatts. It's about the vision of this is going to make your life better, and it's going to help us, like, potentially, bring Nova Scotians and Atlantic Canadians out of energy poverty, and right.
It could if we don't sell it as a hype. It does mean hard policy-related work. How are we going to reform how these projects are financed so it's not on the rate base? How do we ensure that the property tax revenues really do lead to benefits within the community? There's a lot of who's going to be the independent agency that people can trust? Right now, what happens is every single project, citizens start trying to dig up information by themselves, and where do they go? The number one group in Canada that I would say is a detriment or an impediment to our work is Wind Concerns Ontario. They're everywhere, they're all the time. They are getting municipalities to sign unwilling host agreement motions, and no one gets there first. And does it in a way that helps to prepare municipalities for the onslaught that they receive. If we can't get on top of that, I actually don't think all the great modeling is going to actually come to fruition.
I'll take a few more questions from here. I'll avoid the anti-vax subreddit, but one of the questions is, really, can this be translated to other types of major projects? You talked about wind.
Yes, well done. Community benefits are community benefits regardless of the project. So the categories that I listed for you, you see them with nuclear projects, transmission projects, with gas projects. Developers will have a combination of things. Sometimes it's an agreement with municipality. Sometimes it's lease deals, or the property. Nova Scotia requires a percentage of the project to go to property tax. Sometimes it's community funds that a community liaison group disperses funds to community projects. Doesn't matter what the project is. My work is somewhat normative. I'm trying to solve climate change, so I'm not looking at coal projects, so to speak. I'm trying to understand the renewable energy and transmission piece. But they apply to any project.
Who are the voices that should be the messengers, right? Like, well, there's one, what's the message? It's not net zero, we got that.
Yep.
Did everybody get that?
Yep.
Second piece is, who are the messengers, right?
Yeah. So from what I can, in listening to the focus groups, is people actually want to hear from other people like them. So they would prefer, for example, a presentation or a conversation with somebody that lives in a community that had a wind project, because we do actually see a bit of a U effect. When people hear about a project or the idea of renewables versus a project has been built, the people in the middle in the proposed category have lower support because they're anticipating all these negative things. And so we have to counter that anticipatory concern. So you need to bring in people who have lived through projects, who have concrete experience. Municipalities can talk to other municipal councillors and mayors, chief administrative officers, that kind of thing, developers coming in. We really need to see those folks, but less about opinions and argument and oppositional pieces, and more about this is the story, this is what happened. We were worried about health effects, but actually they didn't come, like that kind of thing.
That's credibility when you have.
Yes, the credibility. Yeah.
The question about the data, would you say the sample size was representative of the Canadian kind of population?
Absolutely. You look at the polling that you read, they're talking 1,500 people, and so on. I have 4,232. And yes, it's weighted, of course, to certain demographics, age and region, gender, and so on. So absolutely, it's representative. But I also have a lot of faith. My surveys tell me the what, but my focus groups tell me the why. It really help me with interpretation, and that's at a level of one human, and it still is an important data point as having a huge sample. But it's a really cool sample, and I'm able to do some population segmentation that I didn't even get to talk to you about today. That's really cool. Yeah.
We got to bring in energy efficiency here. There's a good question on basically people's own energy consumption and their willingness to accept energy projects, and whether there's a trade-off between, are people actually thinking about their own energy consumptions in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. We did see a bit of a relationship in the data between people who are familiar and support. It matters. So thinking about familiarity really matters. And so people often argue, a home energy retrofit program is not cost effective because cost per ton is high. I think we're in that world again here federally. But actually, think of it as public engagement. Building that familiarity with the technology is what opens the door. And I did a major study last year on how people perceive affordability, both at the EVs and the heat pumps and things like that. And people generally perceive these technologies as for high income, and it's true. High-income people, it's more for elites, it's not accessible to them. And so these lower to median income programs are really super important in order to get more of this technology in people's hands, secondhand EVs, that kind of thing. But the more familiar they are, the more supportive they are, and they want to know, because they keep hearing all these counter and misinformation about these technologies, whether or not these big projects you want them to support will make their electrification life easier. Yeah.
Amazing. Please help me thank Louise for an amazing presentation. Okay, we're almost there. Our last, but definitely not least, presenter is Pierre-Marie Manache, who is with Ardalis Canada. Pierre-Marie has an extensive expertise in Europe and North America, combining energy modeling and decarbonization strategy. And as an energy consultant specializing in strategic development, he supports producers, regulators, governments, and today he's going to talk to us about, project of common interest, this is, I guess, how the Europeans call it, but it's a European perspective about the framework there. So really excited to your presentation, Pierre. So.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. So yeah, we talked about the PNI. I'll talk about the older brother or sister. It's PCI, a project of common interest, which is like from the old continent, so that makes sense. Okay, so first of all, I'll just have a few words on Ardalis. It's a mathematical optimization company. We do mathematical modeling and optimization and energy modeling. So we are headquartered in Paris. We've been in Montreal for 13 years now. Okay, I'll go quickly on this one. Basically, we do optimization on energy and not only, data science on energy and not only, operational solution, especially in the energy. And finally, I'll talk here about the last one, the energy perspective. So the model that we do, basically, and that we've been doing in Europe on this subject. So this is, we work with public authorities, system operators, energy producers, NGO in the energy field. Okay, so PCI. Yeah, we talked about the PNI. PCI, basically, the PNI is not yet a process with a decision-making process that is completely structured. And in Europe, we've been working on this for a long time. It's been like since like 2009 that this emerged, I think. And the idea here is to guide the energy infrastructure investment. So the PCI is basically a label. So the objective of it is to do the priority on the infrastructure program at the EU level. So the objectives are three: the competitiveness of energy markets, security of supply, and decarbonization. We'll focus on the second one, the orange part, the transparent and evidence-based selection. So you know what PCI does basically, but like how is it selected? It is done through a standardized multi-criteria cost-benefit methodology based on several scenarios. They're all fixed for everyone. And we look at the same indicators on economic, on energy dynamics also, reduction of GHG. And finally, when you have the label, what it allows you, it allows pretty much to, it's like a fast track to have your project on board. So you have like some speed for like the permits, for the governance also, and finally to get like some fundings at the EU. The project could be either from electricity, gas, so biomethane, hydrogen, and also CO2. And the idea here is to optimize the trades between the countries and to lower the overall cost. So this is basically the description of the PCI selection process. You can go like it began like it's September 2024, the last one, and ended in November 2025. So not so long ago. It was like a 1-year process basically. So how does it goes? So first of all, and basically we'll go like through the whole process more deeply, but basically like you'll go to the design of scenarios. So like multi-energy scenarios that everyone agree on. And then the projects are submitted by developers. There is then a gap infrastructure process that is done to see what should we invest in when we have the model. How do we do like capacity expansion basically? And then the projects are assessed through using like this model. And finally, the PCI list is established. So the first step is to do the scenario. So this is a model that is called TYNDP, so 10-year National Development Plan. This is basically done jointly with all TSOs, so like the system operators from both the electricity system and also the gas system. And for the next iteration, you'll have also the hydrogen system. And the idea here is to create a reference EU modeling framework, and everyone can say, like we have like two scenarios, and this like it's plausible that it could be our future basically. The approach to create it is to build a coherent, comprehensive scenario. So the TYNDP is done by, like this, like TYNDP, like a European workforce from every countries, but it takes as an input the national energy of climate plan. So from each member country. And actually, like Artelis authored a study on the behalf of the European Union, the regulator, to see how to better align the national plan with the TYNDP. So that's like we've been working on this subject. And as a result, the TYNDP provides a open data set for both input and outputs that you can then use to put in your like energy models basically, with like covering capacity, install capacity, demand scenarios, solar, wind, hydro time series, many of those. And it's a multi-energy. So once again, like electricity, gas, hydrogen, and CO2. CO2 is like not an energy, but like a commodity. And then from this first step, TYNDP, you can then do the several other steps. So like infrastructure gap, that is another step I'm going to talk about, and the cost-benefit analysis. So once you've done this first step, you can go to the second step, which is promoter submit candidate infrastructure project. And then we go back with the TONDP and we do basically the evaluation of what is needed in the future. We have like the national plans that is kind of put together, and now we have like this capacity expansion that is applied to it to see what should we build in the in 2030, in 2050. So to give you an example, you can see like on the left one result, which is like the needed transmission, cross-border transmission that were identified in the last UNDP. That is 88 additional gigawatts of transmission. So that's a lot. And finally, when you have like this model, you can then do a consistent project assessment. You can say, okay, like, you know, there is like this project that we've that were submitted that wants to be PCI, and then you model with you run the model with this actual project and without the project, and then you see what is the difference. And so this is called the cost-benefit analysis, and it's based on a series of indicators that are very specified, including the impact of socio-economic welfare, the emissions, so GHG emission, also the demand curtailment, and it's not written here, but also the wind integration and like the renewable integration, how it's made easier. So the idea here in this step 4, which is like the crucial part in the PCI process, is to enable fair, transparent, and comparable emission evaluation for each PCI candidate. So we can say that here, you know, like for like the 3 several steps out of 4, there is the multi-energy modeling capacity that are completely essential to it. So this is the software that we use, like Artelis Crystal Supergrid, which is a multi-energy bottom-up platform that does both the operational behavior and also the investments. And this can be used in basically like 3 of the steps that we mentioned. The scenario building, so to create some coherent multi-energy scenarios aligned with the NECPs and the 2 NDPs. Also the infrastructure gap using the capacity expansion. And finally, the cost-benefit analysis. So once again, it's the project with and the model that is run with and without the assessed project. And once this is done, when you have done this 4th step of the PCI, you can have the designation and that is defined with the benefits. So the last list was was published maybe like last month, and you can see like on the right these several projects. So there is some interconnectors project, especially with islands, but also some other project that is inside. So like that could be also some other type of project like storage or you know, like even electrolyzers. So the idea here is to see how it like benefits the overall system. In the latest list, so PCI, PMI, which is like almost PCI, which like that's detail, that includes 235 projects, including electricity projects, hydrogen projects, and also CO2 transport projects. It's not like the total is not 235, there's others, but like this is the main of it. And you can find like, I don't know if like the slide will be shared, but you have also the link here. However, there is also a last thing, because like there is, you know, like kind of the limit of the PCI is that when you talk to some regulators or to some project promoters, they want to have some more assessment on it, especially on the risk that the project could have and could be facing. So to do this, there is like it's like the beyond the PCI assessment is first to identify the key uncertainties. So, for example, gas price. Well, we have like, you know, low or high severity of winter. You know, minus 19 today. Hydraulicity, you know, kind of low right now in Quebec. Energy policy with CO2 pricing, also a subject. breakdown, so like outages, and finally the demand structure. So those are like examples. Then there are some scenarios, are like those uncertainty are combined to create some scenarios, and then you do once again the difference with and without the project for all these scenarios, and you can find as a result, well, the first one for promoters, the most important is the project revenue under various conditions, but also regulators will want to see the CO2 delta, the wind integration possibilities, and the energy security delta. And this helps to bring a robust project analysis using evidence-based data. So the objective here is really like to have like some more robust, even more like beyond the PCI. One example that we've been working on with the French regulator, he asked us basically to assess the transmission project between France and the UK. So we took basically what happened in the T1DP, and we did like some more like refinement with like specificities in France and UK. And we defined some scenarios, so 3 scenarios and some sensitivities that considers gas price, if there's more or less UK offshore evolution also, French nuclear availability that could have like direct impact on like the transmission project. And the kind of results that you can see like on the right is here like for the 3 main scenarios, the difference if you have or not this transmission in terms of generation by type. So in gray here you can see like in negative the thermal impact, the thermal generation that is reduced and that is replaced basically by the wind and solar. And the yellow here is the nuclear, which is like it depends, you know, between the year and the scenarios. But what you can see basically that, you know, from this one, but like there's other indicators that it reduces the use of thermal capacity, so that would be supported, for example, by the French regulator. So if I do a sum up here, multi-energy modeling is at the core of the EU-wide energy planning and the infrastructure project selection. So T1DP is the core modeling framework. Everyone considers more or less like, this is the future that we will have, even though obviously, it will not. And also it is used to define infrastructure needs using capacity expansion. PCIs are then defined using cost-benefit analysis in terms of economics, renewable integration, security and supply, and also environmental values. And it provides a fast-track permitting and ability to apply, especially to EU fundings. But there's some limits, and some uncertainty could be added, and some promoters can ask for some risk analysis to have a more robust project, basically. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Pierre-Marie. Quick question. So this is really focused on the energy side, right? Infrastructure, energy. So we're not seeing things like critical minerals, mining projects, stuff like that, right? Included in this framework?
That's right, yeah.
So the starting point is really, let's figure out how much energy we need and then, get to an agreement on the amount, and then let's figure out what are the projects that can help us meet that demand.
That's basically like the idea. I think that with the years, the main point was to come with security of supply. So basically, it's like how even like we're not asking like for more energy, for example, but what if we have like some more storage, even like underground storage, like gas storage,
yeah,
or like electricity storage, to make sure that if we have like some rupture, we are able to answer this.
And when was this like initiated? Like, how does this map out to like the Ukraine war, energy crisis in Europe vis-a-vis that?
Well, I mean, for the energy security supply, like this has definitely like a point, with this, and it's also with the reduction of hydrolicity, even though even in the north of Europe, like in Norway. That's like some questions that are like more and more important, and but like there's definitely like some link with geopolitics.
Normal. You
Normal.
want to go a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Louise mentioned the importance of transparency. So how much of these data that are being used is public?
We've had this discussion yesterday, so that's fun. The model that is actually used is proprietary. It's Plexos that is used. However, you can get all the input data and output data available, all the time series, all the generation mix, etc., that you can then use and put in your model. And that's actually like if you want to do like the PCI assessment and support project developers, you need actually like to take this TONDP, put it in your model, and then do the assessment. And obviously, this is not exactly the same. There is like some calibration that needs to be done, but there is like some
all the economic data are also public.
I couldn't tell, but I think yes, but I cannot make sure.
Thank you.
On the topic of transparency, we have a few questions here that kind of range on the level of shade thrown at the government. From some of them are pretty explicit, so I'll keep it higher level. To what extent is there political considerations or influence in the PCI?
Well, I mean, like I talked about the NECP with like the national plans. This is basically like ministries that do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But sometimes even the TSO of the very same country doesn't follow this NECP. So that means that the ministry and the actual like operator of the system do not agree with this. Like this is like nonsense. So there is still a gap on this. There is some question about how is the NECP that is then used for the TONDP developed. So there is like some shade on this. And yeah, so like I think that's still an issue like in Europe on this.
Phil? Yeah, so we're gonna actually open it up for questions for everyone if that makes sense. So yeah, go ahead.
I'd speak often with Pierre-Marie, so merci Pierre-Marie. Tyler, Phil Duguay, I'm an independent consultant, work on grid projects mostly. I'm really curious about like all of government understanding of HVDC OEM time frames and components, and has that factored into your modeling? Because just my bias, my fear is that we're not really comprehending how complex and difficult it is to get those OEMs to come here and get that equipment made in our country, as much of it as possible, and just delivered to site. So, and I'm glad that you drove an excavator. That was great color. Thanks for sharing that with us.
It's a great. Going. Okay, thanks. So I can't say the whole. I can't speak to the whole of government. We could survey a bunch of colleagues in this room maybe, but I think a lot in government are very sensitive to the supply chain, to lead time, to some of those real constraints that you're talking about, and I think that's the plan basically, is we're trying to get a handle on some of the actual constraints in buying this stuff. I used to work for the city of Winnipeg, and so I don't represent them now, obviously, but I remember there was a bunch of money put out basically for transit, and it had to be spent within a certain window of time. And so I was working with the transit department, and we were figuring some stuff out, and they said, we can't even buy this within that window of time. It's like there's a 10-year wait for this. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity around that right now.
Hi, my name is Pascal. I'm a manager in risk management. I work for an institutional financial institution, and in a past conference, my questions are for Miss Luis Como. So in a past conference, there was this notion of wanting to simplify the information given to the public and to adapt the communication based on the specific audience we are addressing. So are you in favor of simplifying information at all costs without, however, creating a fertile ground for fake news? And you've mentioned it earlier, people require accountability and transparency from their governments, and what degree of detail should be given to the population to prevent fake news and climate change denial? And the last one, yes, I noticed in one of my experiments that the more explanation and fact-based information you give people, the less likely you are to be believed. So what do you suggest doing?
Louise, that's a lot of questions, but yeah, let's take it.
I'll start there. It is the case that sometimes less is more. There's no doubt about it. However, when you're at the stage of a specific project in your community, people definitely want to know more. But again, it's not so much the technical detail of the turbine. They want to know, how will I be affected in my community? So often it's more of a collective concern than a personal concern, but they also want to know, will I be affected or have any benefits personally? But they're really looking for signals about trust, right? So for example, often a developer will come in and, all projects have the hype phase, right? They'll overstate the economics of the project. They'll overstate the benefits from the project. They'll overstate often the timeline of the project. And so once they get more concrete, they have to start adjusting the information they're providing. And then people say, well, you don't know what you're doing. So, in some cases, less is more, particularly when you don't know everything, and to really watch the hype phase. Having said that, there are going to be information seekers in every community, and they do need detail. They need supports on how you read and interpret an environmental impact assessment. And so it's different audiences. Some people are more general, can I trust these people? Others will say, I very much need specifics. And so you just kind of have to have that menu available to the people to meet their needs.
Thanks, Louise. I'll take one more there.
Thank you. So I put some on Slido, but since you said I could ask, I thought I'd take the opportunity. Okay, so a couple of questions. First of all, for Louise, in your research, to what extent did you look at the potential role of policy in the sense that were there jurisdictions where, there was more transparency and or accountability baked into the policy and maybe that translated to more social acceptance? So that's my question there. And for Tyler, I guess I was curious to know for your input-output model, as Louise's research tells us and a lot of other research, it's really about the processes. And so can your model account for processes? And my final question for Pierre-Marie is to what extent, if you look at when you're modeling the European system, one could argue with all this integration, it actually increases the attack surface in terms of cybersecurity. So I was wondering if you look at that. Thanks.
All right, let's start with Louise.
So in this particular study, I was looking at community benefit agreements, primarily some climate change work and some narrative work. But my previous work has looked particularly at public support for the clean electricity regulation and electrification itself. So I've done a fair bit of research, both survey and focus group on that. And again, it's down to the specifics, right? So what we don't do with these policies is kind of anticipate where the counter arguments will come from. So we are in a very vulnerable place right now with public concern about cost of living, as an example. And so arguments that say, this is going to raise your rates, right off the hop, you've got real resistance coming because nobody's countering that with information prior to them receiving that first bit of information. So this question of pre-bunking and getting into the conversation early is really what we miss. Most of the communications on the clean electricity regulation was at the level of emissions targets, timelines. It wasn't about what does this mean for your electricity in your house. And so we really have to figure out how to, especially at the political level where people are taking their cues, get them to be communicating in ways that are like, we've got to stop talking about Paris and 2035 and 2050, and all of that's got to go. People aren't able to connect to that.
I would add to that, Louise, on the electricity side, maybe it's not just the communication of the policy, but the actual policy design itself. So, Tyler?
Can you clarify your question?
What I meant was, okay, so I'm not an expert in input-output models or what have you, but like when I mean the processes, can you model for a delay because of community opposition? Or maybe your models don't look at that.
You know, so specifically, if there were a delay, yeah, we can factor that sort of thing in. Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Pierre-Marie?
Yeah. So the question was about the security regarding the cyber attack, right?
The integration.
Actually, what we see in Europe, like what you can see, like on a grid, is like the inertia and like the frequency to see like if it's stable or not. And you can see that in Europe, since we are like all interconnected, we have like some more inertia. So we have less fluctuation in the stability in the frequency than we have here in North America, since we are actually like more islands. This is that's it. Even though this is a bit less true with the great integration of renewable, but this is still what have been seen on networks.
Thanks.
You have been a very great crowd. 2 hours in, feels like 5 minutes, right? Time flies when you're having fun. Final words you want to leave our audience with? Maybe we'll start with Pierre-Marie there.
Yeah. I think that we've talked about this, and the questions were about is it transparent or not? I think that there is like some work to do still in Europe, but they do collaborate.
Better than provinces?
But yeah.
Open question.
Well, they collaborate. End of the sentence.
Louise?
Well, just to say, I mean, I think social acceptance needs to be considered more explicitly in the work that y'all do, and how to do that, well, I'll leave that to the experts to sort through. But there's a currency here that matters, that's different than the technology or the policy.
Thanks, Louise. Tyler?
I think I said it earlier, but we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I think that we as a community across Canada really need to come together and solve some pretty unprecedented challenges. So I think that, the more of this that we can do, the better.
I think we can see from the diversity on this panel that like lots of different modeling and research approaches are necessary to answer these questions. So whether that's through a multi-model comparison where lots of models are trying to answer the same question in the same way, or from approaching it from different ways, I think there's a lot of benefit to that, and there's a lot of continued research that needs to happen into how that can be integrated and effectively worked into policy and project selection.
And with that, as you know, the Energy Modeling Hub is really committed to transparency in both methods and data, and hopefully that can help with what Maddie just spoke to, and also to increase credibility among the public.
Awesome. And I think, what we've heard today, it's been great to kind of see the perspectives on, the impact of these projects, right? And whether it's from the multi-model comparison, the work that NRCan is doing to help add the analytical rigor, the work that Louise is doing to get the social support, or, inspiration from Pierre-Marie's European model. So this was I learned a lot, great panel. Please help me thank our amazing panelists. And you are free to have coffee.